Men's March Madness 2025. All the scores in the NCAA basketball tournament. Here's the complete schedule for the 2025 NCAA tournament. Each year, the NCAA men's basketball tournament, known as March Madness, captures the attention of millions of fans around the world. With college teams battling for glory, the tournament offers a unique mix of excitement, surprises, and historic moments. From the early rounds to the final play of the championship, March Madness is one of the most anticipated and watched sporting events of the year. With a structure full of unpredictable matchups and a single elimination format, anything can happen, and 2025 will be no exception. Get ready to experience a tournament filled with action, rivalries, and drama. NCAA Men's March Madness 2025. Bracket: Men's March Madness 2025. Yes, that's the big deal. All the scores in the NCAA basketball tournament. Here's the complete schedule for the 2025 NCAA tournament. Each year, the NCAA men's basketball tournament, known as March Madness, captures the attention of millions of fans around the world. With college teams battling for glory, the tournament offers a unique mix of excitement, surprises, and historic moments. From the early rounds to the final play of the championship, March Madness is one of the most anticipated and watched sporting events of the year. With a structure full of unpredictable matchups and a single elimination format, anything can happen, and 2025 will be no exception. Get ready to experience a tournament filled with action, rivalries, and drama. Men's March Madness 2025 schedule. Here's the complete schedule for the 2025 NCAA tournament. Selection Sunday is on March 16th. The first four will be on March 18th and 19th. The first round is set for March 20th and 21st. The second round follows on March 22nd and 23rd. The Sweet 16 games are on March 27th and 28th. The Elite 8 will be held on March 29th and 30th. The Final Four is scheduled for April 5th, and the NCAA championship game will be on April 7th. The first four will be played in Dayton, Ohio. The first and second rounds are in Cleveland, Denver, Lexington, Kentucky, Milwaukee, Providence, Rhode Island, Raleigh, North Carolina, Seattle, and Wichita, Kansas. The regional semifinals, or Sweet 16 and finals, the Elite 8, will take place in Newark, New Jersey for the East region, Atlanta for the South, Indianapolis for the Midwest, and San Francisco for the West. The tournament concludes with the Final Four and championship game at the Alamodome in San Antonio. Men's March Madness 2025 bracket. First four, Tuesday, March 18th. 16th seeded Alabama State 70, 68 for 16th seeded St. Francis, 11th seeded San Diego State 68, 95 for 11th seeded North Carolina. Wednesday, March 19th, 16th seeded American University 72, 83 for 16th seeded Mount St. Mary's, 11th seeded Texas 80, 86 for 11th seeded Xavier. First round, also known as the Round of 64, Thursday, March 20th, 8th seeded Louisville 75-89 for 9th seeded Creighton, 4th seeded Purdue 75-63 for 13th seeded High Point, 3rd seeded Wisconsin 85-66 for 14th seeded Montana, 1st seeded Houston 78-40 for 16th seeded SIU Edwardsville, 1st seeded Auburn 83-63 for 16th seeded Alabama State, 5th seeded Clemson 67-69 for 12th seeded McNeese, 6th seeded BYU 80-71 for 11th seeded VCU, 8th seeded Gonzaga 89-68 for 9th seeded Georgia, 2nd seeded Tennessee 77-62 for 15th seeded Wofford, 7th seeded Kansas 72-79 for 10th seeded Arkansas, 4th seeded Texas AANDM 80-71 for 13th seeded Yale, 6th seeded Missouri 57-67 for 11th seeded Drake, 7th seeded UCLA 72-47 for 10th seeded Utah State, 2nd seeded St. John's 83-53 for 15th seeded Omaha, 5th seeded Michigan 68-65 for 12th seeded UC San Diego, 3rd seeded Texas Tech 82-72 for 14th seeded UNC Wilmington. Friday, March 21st. 8th seeded Mississippi State 72-75 for 9th seeded Baylor. 2nd seeded Alabama 90, 81 for 15th-seeded Robert Morris. 3rd-seeded Iowa State 82, 55 for 14th-seeded Lipscomb. 5th-seeded Memphis 70, 78 for 12th-seeded Colorado State. 1st-seeded Duke 93, 49 for 16th-seeded Mount St. Mary's. 7th-seeded St. Mary's 59, 56 for 10th-seeded Vanderbilt. 6th-seeded Ole Miss 71, 64 for 11th-seeded North Carolina. 4th-seeded Maryland 81, 49 for 13th-seeded Grand Canyon. 1st-seeded Florida 95, 69 for 16th-seeded Norfolk State. 3rd-seeded Kentucky 76, 57 for 14th-seeded Troy. 7th-seeded Marquette 66, 75 for 10th-seeded New Mexico. 4th-seeded Arizona 93, 65 for 13th-seeded Akron. 8th-seeded UConn 67, 59 for 9th-seeded Oklahoma. 6th-seeded Illinois 86, 73 for 11th-seeded Xavier. 2nd-seeded Michigan State 87, 62 for 15th-seeded Bryant. 5th-seeded Oregon 81, 52 for 12th-seeded Liberty. Second round, also known as the Round of 32, took place on Saturday, March 22nd. Purdue, the 4th seed, triumphed over the 12th-seeded McNeese with a score of 76-62. 2nd-seeded St. John's fell to 10th-seeded Arkansas, 66-75. In a high-scoring game, 5th-seeded Michigan defeated 4th-seeded Texas A&M 79-91. Texas Tech, the 3rd seed, won against 11th-seeded Drake, 77-64. Auburn, the top seed, emerged victorious over 9th-seeded Creighton, 82-70. Wisconsin, the 3rd seed, narrowly lost to 6th-seeded BYU, 89-91. Houston, the number 1 seed, edged out 8th-seeded Gonzaga, 81-76. Finally, Tennessee, the 2nd seed, overcame 7th-seeded UCLA, 67-58. On Sunday, March 23rd, the action continued. Top-seeded Florida narrowly defeated 8th-seeded UConn, 77-75. Duke, the number 1 seed, dominated 9th-seeded Baylor, 89-66. 3rd-seeded Kentucky bested 6th-seeded Illinois, 84-75. 2nd-seeded Alabama overpowered 7th-seeded St. Mary's, 80-66. 4th-seeded Maryland squeaked past 12th-seeded Colorado State, 72-71. In a surprising turn, 6th-seeded Ole Miss crushed 3rd-seeded Iowa State, 91-71. 2nd-seeded Michigan State secured a win over 10th-seeded New Mexico, 71-63. Lastly, 4th-seeded Arizona edged out 5th-seeded Oregon in a close match, 87-83. The Sweet 16 games took place on Thursday, March 27th. 2nd-seeded Alabama triumphed over 6th-seeded BYU with a commanding score of 113-88. Top-seeded Florida defeated 4th-seeded Maryland, 87-71. Duke, the number 1 seed, outlasted 4th-seeded Arizona in a high-scoring game, 100-93. Finally, Texas Tech, the 3rd seed, narrowly edged out 10th-seeded Arkansas, 85-83. Friday, March 28th. Michigan State, the number 2 seed, edged out Ole Miss with a score of 73-70. Tennessee, another number 2 seed, defeated Kentucky 78-65. Auburn, the top seed, also won their game, beating Michigan 78-65. And finally, Houston, the number 1 seed, narrowly overcame Purdue with a score of 62-60. Elite 8, Saturday, March 29th, Florida 84, Texas Tech 79, Duke 85, Alabama 65. Houston 69, Tennessee 50, Auburn 70, Michigan State 64. Final 4, Florida 79, Auburn 73, Duke 67, Houston 70. National Championship. Monday, April 7th, Florida vs. Houston, 8:50 p.m. Thank you for watching, and please kindly subscribe to our channel today, and we will continue to produce news contents from around the world for you.